time, sorry.
She being the she?
Right.
The she, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Good afternoon, members. Thank you very much for coming along. Can I take the emergency evacuation announcement as read?
Yes.
Thank you very much. But can I just ask you to turn off your mobile phones? Just before we start this meeting, I have confirmed with Sonia that we will not be contravening her in any way to discuss these items, and they are purely on the basis that they are supporting evidence of situations. So it's business as usual. So we have checked all that information out. Okay, moving on. Item 1, apologies for absence. Sonia?
We have apologies from Councillors Mason and Councillor Stanley.
Fine. Non-members attending?
Councillor Ward.
Councillor Ward. Minutes of the meeting held on the 31st of January 2019. Can I take those as correct and accepted?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Any declarations of interest? Okay. Well, I think we'll do our usual process. We'll pass over to Dan now to give us a précis of each particular agenda item as we go through it, and question anything that you raised, Dan.
Okay, that's fine. So this item concerns the Essex Coast Rams. This is a strategy that has been put together by officers at the council, along with officers from 10 other local authorities across Essex, and with professional advice from Natural England. And the purpose of the strategy is to ensure that housing growth in Essex does not cause undue impacts on protected environmental sites along the Essex coast, and particularly the impacts from recreational disturbance, which may be walkers, dog walkers, and similar activities that occur along the Essex coast, which is protected in legislation for its sensitive habitats, including for birds and other wildlife. So the council has obligations under the habitat regulations to make sure that plans and projects do not have an impact on the integrity of those sites. It's been identified through the Essex Coast Rams that mitigation is needed to offset the impacts from future housing growth across Essex, which is obviously likely to be substantial when taken into account across the whole of the county. And through surveying and costing of mitigation, it's been concluded that for every new house built, a tariff contribution of £122.30 should be collected from the developer or the applicant in order to fund this mitigation. So this RAM strategy essentially sets out all of the evidence to support that tariff, the legal need to seek a tariff, and the specific evidence supporting the value of the tariff and where the tariff will apply. And for information, the whole of Rochford District is covered by that tariff. So just to say, the alternatives to taking this strategic approach would have been to require potentially every applicant on a new housing development, even one that only consisted of one new dwelling, to undertake their own extensive surveying, which would have been much more costly and time intensive than the approach that has been taken. Therefore, this approach is considered to be not only sound but also logical and prudent and cost effective in front loading that exercise. And just to close, it's worth noting that a formal supplementary planning document is likely to follow, which will provide a bit more detail on exactly how the tariff will be collected and what types of development fall within its scope. And in accordance with regulations, that supplementary planning document will need to be subject to public consultation, and it would be for the council to decide whether to adopt it at a later date. So the recommendation before members is that they note the strategy that has been produced by the council along with other councils as evidence and to upload it to the council's website.
Thanks, Dan. Any questions, anybody?
Please. Can I?
Carol.
I just, yeah. Just probably a silly question, really. I'm going to ask anyway. Regarding Holbridge, because obviously Holbridge is right on the end of the estuary or whatever you want to call it. What happens about the sites that that have mobile homes put on different sites? I mean, do we look at anything like that at all? Because I mean, we've got a site down there. I think that they're revamping completely and having a whole load of new mobile homes put in place. I mean, they're static. They're not. Oh, okay, you can move them, but then you can knock down a house to build a house again. Do we sort of look into anything like that from the landowner to get?
Well, any kind of development that consists of new residential units, which would include caravans, provided that they are, I guess, permanent accommodation instead of, I guess, holiday caravans where they might only be occupied for a certain amount of the year. Planning applications that come in for permanent caravans would be liable to pay the tariff. It might be that applications have been recently determined, which obviously predate this strategy and therefore have not had a tariff collected. But this is very much Natural England's new preferred approach to mitigation for these sites, and therefore there is a line drawn, and really from now onwards it should be that these tariff contributions are collected. So larger scale developments in the past will have been screened for the habitat regs, and the large 500 home site in Holbridge was subject to what you'd call a habitat regs assessment, and that determined that actually provision of open space on the site and everything else was sufficient to mitigate, because clearly perhaps dog walkers can use that large open space instead of going and walking along the coast. But from now onwards, it's very much a contribution-based process instead of, I suppose, looking at individual applications on their own merits, which, as I've said, is quite an inefficient way of doing it, and actually, even for applicants, would involve them going through a lot more time and expense than. I guess as a council, we've essentially front-loaded that process for them and removed some of the burden. So. Yes, permanent caravans will apply, but it's I guess from now onwards, and there's not a lot that can be done legally for things in the past.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Ward.
Thank you very much. I think what is interesting, if you go to 5.8 on the document, you will see the zoning, and the zoning is quite massive. As Dan quite rightly said, it takes in the whole of Rochford. It also takes in South End, Castle Point, a large chunk of Basildon, quite a hell of a chunk of Thurrock. It then moves up into Malden, Ucklesfield. It covers Chelmsford. It's a massive chunk, and as far as I can see, it would be literally on any new property there would be a levy which is contributing towards what is recreational disturbance and a mitigation strategy.
Okay. Okay.
That's it.
Where's
Thank you.
5.8?
Have you not got 5.8?
It's
Yes.
Yeah.
yes.
On the back.
I didn't go on the back.
Oh, right.
I assumed I was in the wrong document. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, the recommendation is that the subcommittee resolves that the Essex Coast Recreational Disturbance Avoidance and Mitigation Strategy, in brackets RAMS, 2018 to 2038, as set out in Appendix A, be noted as evidence and uploaded on the Council's website. All in agreement?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Right, moving on to agenda item number 6. Over to you again, Dan.
Okay, so as members will be aware, the council is going through a process of trying to prepare a new local plan. and part of that requires obviously that technical evidence is produced to support the emerging policies in those plans. So this item is one particular piece of evidence that has been prepared, which has reviewed the Council's local wildlife sites policies. So just to give a bit of background, local wildlife sites are pieces of land which are designated for their wildlife value. Typically they are considered worthy of protection at a local level, but they are not as important as other sites which are protected under other legislation, including sites of special scientific interest, which, for example, Hockley Woods is one of those sites. So these are sites where development is likely to be highly restricted because clearly they are worthy of protection for their wildlife value. So the review looked at all the existing designated sites across the district, which were 39, as well as sites that had previously been designated but had been undesignated in the last review, as well as a small number of other sites which were put forward to consider. And it's assessed them against a consistent criteria to assess their wildlife value. And it has been recommended by the consultants who have prepared this that a total of 46 sites are worthy of designation, and one existing site at Doggett's Pond is potentially no longer worthy of designation. Just one thing I would note is that clearly this is evidence, so this does not change planning policy. But when the council is drafting its new local plan, it will obviously need to take into account this evidence, and it may well be that a future policy on local wildlife sites seeks to amend the current designations to take into account these additional sites which may be worthy of protection. So at the moment it's clearly just evidence, but it is intended that this will inform the ongoing plan making for the district. And again, the recommendation is that this is noted as evidence and published on the council's website.
Okay.
A
Carol.
quick question then.
Yes, sir.
So if this goes through that you're going to put these are protected sites, does that mean to say that they'll never ever be able to build on them?
It makes it very unlikely that development would be permitted on them, at least for the duration of the plan that they are within. So I suppose clearly in let's say 20 years' time, it might be that another officer is sat here presenting another local wildlife sites review which says that actually maybe a couple of these sites are no longer worthy of protection, and they might be making a recommendation that actually those sites are undesignated, and I guess at that point perhaps the prospect of development on those sites is more likely. However, what I would say is that the vast majority of these sites are likely to be protected under other designations, not least within the Greenbelt, and therefore there are also other reasons why development on these sites may be unlikely. But this local wildlife sites designation gives them an additional level of protection for their wildlife value. If that wildlife value deteriorates, then there is obviously the prospect that they may be worthy of undesignating, but that's I suppose a decision for this council at a later date, depending on the evidence that exists at that time.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Ward?
Yeah, it's in regards to Doggett's Pond. Is that particular one in close proximity to a new application?
In terms of a
planning
application, I can check the exact site boundary. It is obviously in the vicinity. It is not too distant from the allocated site in South East Ashton,
Yes,
but it's not located within that site,
No.
and therefore the designation of that site was never likely to have an impact on that site being developed, and the undesignation of it, if that's what the council chooses to do through its local plan, does not necessarily make development on it any more likely than it is now, because clearly it is also subject to other constraints which are likely to be factors. So I suppose there is a fine line between sites that are protected for their wildlife value and therefore afforded greater protection through planning policy, and sites which are also designated in the green belt and other designations which perhaps have, I suppose, more numerous reasons why they might not be developed. So I suppose declassification of a site doesn't necessarily mean that it's any more likely to be developed. It's purely on the basis of its wildlife value.
Yeah, going on the Doggett's Pond, because that's in my ward, and I don't know if I need to raise a... read through the details, but I still don't understand why it's been removed from the list. I still can't get my head around it, because I do live around that area, and there is a lot of wildlife around that area, birds and animals, wild animals, and if you can sort of explain the reasons behind it, that would be great.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'll just get up the specific assessment for that site. I mean, I suppose it's worth pointing out that these recommendations have been on the basis of surveying done by ecological specialists on the basis of a specific set of criteria. So my belief is that the reason why they are recommending that it is potentially undesignated is because they consider it no longer to meet criteria. So it might still hold some wildlife value, but obviously if we were to go to a local plan examination and be trying to justify to a government inspector why we are proposing to designate certain sites, it would have to be on the basis of I guess robust evidence about the wildlife qualities of that site, and clearly, I mean, in this case, the consultants who have undertaken this assessment consider that site no longer is worthy of protection. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that the council has to choose to undesignate it, but it might be that it's something that once the local plan has developed a little bit more, the council wants to pay more attention to in terms of whether or not they consider at that point in time, which may be more than a year or two away, whether they think it's still or whether they think it's justified to consider undesignating that site. So I suppose what I'd reiterate is this is evidence, but it doesn't constitute policy. So Doggett's Pond is still a designated local wildlife site. It's still protected from development in that sense. It's just as the council is drafting, its new local plan, it will need to consider, and this obviously includes the members making the decision whether or not all of those sites are still worthy of designation. And in this sense, it's I suppose that the consultants have surveyed the site on more than one occasion, and have considered that it doesn't tick enough of the criteria to be worthy of designation. I mean, unfortunately, I'm not an ecological expert, so I couldn't necessarily say exactly why that is, but it is nonetheless their professional recommendation.
Oh, right. Okay.
Chair.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks for your detailed response on that. But I still feel uncomfortable, and I'd like to put a motion on the table to until we review the policies, that it remains as a designated site. But I'm only going by experience and living in the area and the usage of the area by residents and outside bodies, where they do a lot of activities down there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know how to formulate this motion, but I would like some advice from our officer in how to take it forward.
I've just been having this very conversation, George, so go on in and then we'll come back to it.
I personally think that because I know that I asked, obviously, Dan the question, to the answer of which I knew, with new development at Ashington and its close proximity. I think that it could be contentious, and I think it should be noted, even though we're noting this document. This particular item should be noted that there are, how can I put it, concerns regarding its change of designation, and it should be highlighted that concerns were highlighted during this meeting. Albeit it's not policy yet, but you know, when this comes back, it needs to be discussed further in regards to its situation, because I know that there's a development that's why I asked, that development in close proximity, and I wondered if that was the reason why Doggett has now been de-designated, so to speak, because of it, and all the things that go with the new the application that's coming through in Ashington, that large application that's coming through. Yeah,
Okay.
so because I believe it could be contentious, I think it should be left as highlighted, in my opinion.
I mean, just speaking to the officer, Councillor Ward, we can certainly make a note to this effect. Yeah, I mean, it's pleasing to note that we've actually included 8 new sites.
Absolutely.
But I mean, the concern has been expressed by about Doggett's Pond. We will highlight that as you've requested. And
may I just say as well,
Yeah.
I suppose the point I would clarify is that this document will not change policy. So if a planning application came in a month's time to develop Doggett's Pond, I mean, the local wildlife site designation would still be in place, and therefore, amongst probably many other reasons, you know, that would be a reason why that would never be countenanced. I suppose I suppose this document is evidence, so it's not going to change policy, but it could be used to inform a new policy approach, and so I suppose the recommendation that's being made does achieve, I think, what you're asking for, in the sense that it's not going to declassify this site, but I'm happy that before we present members with any kind of I suppose local plan approach based on this evidence, that the issue of Doggett's Pond is revisited to consider whether or not it is a robust position to consider de-designating it. I mean, the report itself, just to clarify, says that that there is limited species information available, and they've said it's not certain that the selection criteria can be met. So on that basis, I'm happy that potentially on the basis of revisiting that, it's not impossible, it's not necessarily unlikely that that those species are present. It's just that clearly we have got this professional information in front of us that potentially need to double check potentially, but I suppose the crucial thing is that this evidence will not change policy on its own, and therefore there's nothing likely to change as a result of this evidence.
I mean, our officer will reflect these concerns in the minutes, George.
Yeah.
And as I say, with those duly noted in the minutes, the recommendation is that the local wildlife sites review 2018 set out in Appendix A be noted as evidence and published on the council's website, take into account the issues that we have highlighted.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yes. That's fine.
Can I
Right.
ask another question on it?
Yes, certainly.
I noticed on a lot of these you've got lots of the different sites are either ownership run by somebody or you don't know who's owned it. Where does that put the council in place if you wanted to, I don't know, redevelop? And people who own these sites, do they know about what this document?
Yeah.
And people, once the sites that we don't know who owns them, and maybe later on you want to do something with it, how do you go about?
So in terms of the landowners of sites that are in this, you'd likely find that a lot of them are public land, whether that's land owned by this council, land owned by Essex County Council, land owned by other public bodies. There are some sites that are owned by private landowners, but the vast majority of these are sites which have been historically designated as local wildlife sites, so therefore this is nothing new to those people. In terms of whether a private landowner would want to see any of these sites developed and whether that might conflict with this local wildlife sites designation, I mean, in some ways, the fact that these sites are rich in wildlife means that actually landowners cannot take action which purposefully deteriorates that wildlife. So if a private landowner owned a piece of land that was designated as local wildlife site and they subsequently wanted to build houses on it, the likelihood is that would have to be scrutinised very, very, very heavily, because there's no doubt that would have an undue impact on that wildlife that would either need to be mitigated or, in some way compensated. In terms of whether the council is likely to want to consider developing any of these sites, I would say it's unlikely that the policy function of this council would consider actively recommending sites which it knows conflict with these local wildlife sites. Perhaps where they are within a wider area or they are adjacent to, perhaps that development would need to deliver some kind of buffer or mitigation or compensation. It's unlikely that development would ever be permitted on a local wildlife site unless we could, I guess, demonstrably show how that wildlife can be, I suppose, recreated elsewhere. So, and that's not just within planning. That does spread into wider laws about protecting wildlife and everything else. So, hopefully that answers.
Okay, yeah, fine. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Okay. Thank you for that, Dan. Okay, moving on. Item number 7. Area very close to my own heart. Here you go again, Dan.
Yes, so the council, along with officers from Basildon, Cross Point and Southend Borough Council, and supported by representatives from Sport England, have jointly commissioned a consultancy to basically undertake an assessment of playing pitch and built facilities within the district and within the neighbouring authorities listed. So this included, I suppose, both quantitative assessment in terms of considering whether the amount of provision was enough and was going to be enough in the future, particularly in the context of the likely population growth of the area. But also looking qualitatively at whether those facilities were of the right quality to actually support that use, whether there was need for maintenance or improvement. So these strategies and action plans have been developed primarily to provide evidence from the planning perspective in terms of what actions are likely to be needed to address playing pitches and built facilities in the future, particularly in the context, like I say, of future population growth. But there has also been engagement from the council's leisure and open spaces teams, particularly with regard to recommendations on maintenance and other issues like this. So primarily the recommendations tend to be quite positive. There are only a small number of areas where the district is likely to be, I suppose, in severe need of action with regard to playing pitches, and that's particularly with regard to 3G artificial pitches, which are currently quite uncommon, and which are increasingly preferred over grass pitches because they can handle obviously much more play without deteriorating. However, other issues with supply were noted. However, these are only quite minor and are likely to be resolvable relatively easy. And in terms of quality, pitches in the district are generally of a standard of good quality, and it was noted by the consultants that this district compares quite favourably with nationally in terms of the quality of its playing pitches. So the other aspect of this was about indoor built facilities, so that's mostly leisure centres, but also kind of local halls that might house some of this activity. Generally speaking, the recommendations were not particularly extensive. It was mostly around exploring opportunities to see whether school facilities could be used to provide some additional capacity in areas which do not have fantastic existing capacity, and a need to work with neighbours to consider how the future demand for swimming can be accommodated. What it doesn't do is suggest that any significant additional provision is needed, and as I'm sure you can imagine, the type of population growth needed to justify a new leisure centre or something like that is actually quite great, and thus, whilst developer contributions may be sought to improve facilities and improve capacity, they were not suggesting that we plan for whole new facilities in their own right. And it is just worth saying that they particularly singled out Clements Hall Leisure Centre as a facility that they considered to need investment, which obviously extends beyond just the planning process. So this strategy and action plan is just a point in time assessment, and there is an ambition that it will be regularly updated to make sure that it stays up to date, and that local sports clubs are kept in the loop about what's likely to happen in the future. And it is also worth just noting that a South Essex wide playing pitch and built facility strategy has been prepared, which brings together some of the more strategic cross-boundary issues. However, that will be put before members at a later date once it is ready. Therefore, the strategies being shown to members now are just those recommendations that relate to Rochford. So the recommendation again is that these are noted as evidence published on the Council's website, and subject to reviews, these can be used to inform the Council's approach in its emerging local plan.
Okay. Well, I'll kick off with some of these. But you've suggested in there that these will be regularly updated. What sort of period are you talking? 3 years, 5 years?
Well, I think
less than that, more than that?
Should be less than that. I think the ambition is that there will be a steering group or an implementation group established. So that will have on it representatives from the council, likely to include potentially leisure and open space officers, particularly as well. Representatives from local clubs, representatives from Sport England, and that will consider, I suppose, the need to review the findings of this and make amendments to the recommendations. So, clearly it is a moving feast in terms of, there is likely to be, fluctuations in demand, fluctuations in supply. you know, clubs that emerge and clubs that, you know, for want of a better phrase, go bust, and therefore it is only ever can be, I suppose, a point in time snapshot of the health, if you like, of playing pitches and built facilities at that point in time. But the ambition is that it will be regularly updated, and that, in my mind, means, you know, really looking at a new set of recommendations and action plans potentially every 18 months to 24 months. I suppose from a planning policy perspective, Sport England have produced what they call a calculator in order to help consider what kind of additional provision might be needed to support potentially new developments, and that will take into account the most up-to-date evidence on pitch capacity, pitch quality. So if a development is adjacent to a lot of unused pitches, you know, the need for new pitches is going to be lesser than, you know, if a development is in the vicinity of pitches that are in use, you know, 9 till 5 every single day of the week, you know. So it is, I suppose, evidence to inform that policy approach. I haven't placed much emphasis on the recommendations that have more to do with the operations and maintenance, because clearly that's a wider question for the council, not particularly within my planning policy remit, but it's worth saying that both leisure and open space officers have been engaged in this process, and should they wish, you know, this is obviously a bank of evidence for them to.
I mean, it seems to me, and going from my experience of being involved in this, the present lack of interest in utilising the pitches is just allowing pitches to rest and recuperate from many years of heavy use. I mean, you've got pitches now that haven't been used for the second, maybe third year. It's doing them no harm just to rest after all the thing they've been. And quite coincidentally, I was approached outside this situation to seek guidance about how one particular club might become involved in obtaining sponsorship for a 3G pitch in the district. So they are liaising with Mr. Houghton and Mr. Aldridge on this aspect at the moment. So, you know, we are actually moving down the road that is being recommended quite independently.
Yeah, I suppose the other thing with 3D pitches as well is thinking about how, I suppose, growth can contribute to things like that. So, you know, it can be difficult, I suppose, for these things to be funded, especially if they're by clubs who, you know, only have limited means. But, you know, I suppose one role of planning policy when it comes to playing pitches and everything else is considering actually how development can help deliver some of these things, and whether that means the future growth of the district be what it may, helps to fund new 3G pitches, helps to fund you know, quality improvements at local leisure centres. You know, that can only be a positive.
A positive, yeah, definitely. Anything else?
Can I just ask you, I noticed on page 783, it's the research findings, on it says the weaknesses, and one of it is the poor quality of Greensward Academy is deteriorating and requiring urgent and significant investment. Greensward Academy has spent a lot of money over the last year or so, a couple of years or so, updating the whole of their facilities. I don't know whether that's not been taken into consideration.
What I would say, I suppose, is that this report is now, I wouldn't say it's old, but it's not based on, I suppose, assessments that took place very, very recently, and that, I suppose, re-highlights what we've discussed about the need to review, because it might be that actually when this report was being prepared, actually Greenswood's facilities were, you know, perhaps not particularly strong compared to other facilities in the district. It may well be now that actually that investment's taken place, and therefore those facilities, if they were resurveyed, would actually come up very, very strongly. So it is, unfortunately, I suppose, the main issue with evidence-based reports is that they are accurate at the time of writing, and some things change very little over long periods of time, and then other things like, I suppose, taking a snapshot of pitch quality and everything else, there is obviously always that risk that elements of it become out of date quickly. And no doubt if we reviewed this, began another review now and then came back to this group in, say, 4 or 5 months with another thing, it might be that in that interim period, there might be other changes that aren't reflected. So it is noted, and I suppose all I can say is that as part of any review, obviously any changes of circumstance will be picked up as part of that. It's just even things like local football club deciding to fold, that might actually have a big impact on these figures. But if it happens a week after we've signed off the report, see what I mean? It becomes out of date quite quickly. So, and something like this is very, very, unfortunately, very, very prone to becoming out of date quickly, because it is about, I suppose, mostly about numbers and things like that. Whereas something like the local wildlife sites review, it's unlikely that if you go to a local wildlife site review from one week to the next, there will be much change, any deteriorations over a long period of time. So, I suppose what I would say is that any changes will be picked up in the review, and I hope to be in a position to bring back something to this group, probably in the next 12 months. And it may well be, it may have a different name, but it's likely to be materially very similar.
Okay, thanks Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just going to mention the leisure contract and ask the question, how does this then fit in with that, because it's due to be renewed, replaced, got rid of, whatever in
23. I mean,
soon?
when
There's a comment about the inadequacy of permissible provision.
I mean, when this was being prepared, I think discussions were held about these leisure centres and about obviously the contract that currently exists, and it was noted by officers in other parts of the council that actually it's not the case, I suppose, that we can suddenly make demands or suggestions or anything for the way the existing contract is written, and therefore some of these recommendations are obviously a bit more longer term, and they're a bit more, I suppose, about things to bear in mind, I suppose, when the council is considering how to proceed with that, or any existing or future contractors who may take that on. Yeah, I mean it's a difficult one, I suppose, from a planning policy perspective, because obviously this is the kind of issue that straddles a lot of different areas of the council, and whilst this has been primarily developed from a planning policy perspective, it obviously is also, I suppose, makes the kind of recommendations which really would need to be picked up by other parts of the council who are responsible for the leisure centres and who are responsible for playing pitches. And whilst those people have been engaged, obviously it's all it does, I suppose, is provide information that they can choose to use or not use. But I would hope that it provides information about, I suppose, sports provision within those leisure centres that is of use to the leisure contractor and is of use to the council when making decisions about how to proceed with that. But if that contract is unlikely to be up in the next couple of years, then again a review of this may actually bring out things that are a bit more, I suppose, poignant at that point in time. So it isn't something that's been considered in great detail in here, because clearly, I suppose to some extent it's not planning policy's role to try and necessarily influence the outcomes of that contractor process. But hopefully, like I say, it provides information that is still relevant and usable for those other teams should they want to do it. It may be that they choose to actually undertake, at a later date, their own, be it market research or whatever, and make recommendations based on their information as well. Hopefully.
Yeah, it brings a lot of other questions, but not really relevant for here. Thank you, Dan.
Councillor Wall.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's just following on from what Councillor Weston said, and I think there needs to be a wee bit more clarity, because the very start of the report actually says where they jointly commissioned Wright, Kavanagh and Page. It would be useful to actually to know when that commissioning was. So that could have been 2015. The report was actually completed in November 2018, and we're now April 2019. So, you know, we're looking at a moving target which has moved on quite considerably, and I guess things have either got better or they've got worse. And so I think it's worthwhile always, when we come to doing something like this, is just putting a caveat in there which will save the kind of questions that actually Councillor Weston has really pointed out with regard to noticing that Greenswood is not what it was, but it has improved. And I think that would cover, you know, so much, and it would help to explain to future readers that, you know, save that question, keep on coming up, hang on, this has changed or this hasn't happened. It just explains really at the front that, you know, we've got a moving target here. This is a snapshot taken at the time of commissioning, and it takes this amount of time to publish it, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, it is basically a snapshot, and it's a moving target.
Yeah, I think, you know, all the points that have been raised, we will reflect in the minutes quite clearly. I think all of them have been very worthwhile. And I hope that, you know, we'll be around next year or so to see some of them implemented, and the recommendations that we brought forward. If there's no other questions, the recommendation is that the Rochford District Council playing pitch strategy and indoor built facility strategy set out in Appendix A and B respectively be noted as evidence and published on the Council's website. Agreed?
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you. Just before I close the meeting, because that is the last item, this is obviously going to be the last meeting, potentially, where the committee as was would meet. Can I just thank you for the support and what we've achieved over the last year? I think we've done quite a lot of work, perhaps not been as successful as we might have liked in some areas. Hopefully, if you wish to be involved again next year, you will be. Thanks, Dan, for your contribution. It's been outstanding, particularly in light of the fact that where we once had 3 planning officers, we've now got 1. Policy officer, planning officers. We've now got 1, and the knock-on effect that's has had on you. Hopefully, by the next meeting, there'll be some support for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman.
All right.
Now the meeting is over, can I ask about the resource issue?
No, you can't.